Namaste, everyone. Jaya Shriman Narayana.
Jaya Shriman Narayana.
It's absolutely my pleasure to be here with everyone. What we're going to do now is, again, we're going to speak just a little bit more about yoga psychology, not for much more, a few minutes, and then we're going to dive into these verses. For people who did not hear the introduction to my talk that was last time, the recording is available everywhere at this point. It's on YouTube, so please feel free, if you have not heard that yet, to listen to that, because that was part one, and I'm going to be ending that talk now by talking about various aspects of what it means to be psychologically healthy. What is meant by yoga psychology? Yoga psychology juxtaposed to other forms of psychology, etc., etc. Well, what I'm going to be talking about now is the last aspect, and a very important aspect, and that is sense of identity. Sense of identity. Now, every living being has a sense of identity. If they didn't have a sense of identity, they would not be a living being by definition. What is meant by a sense of identity? It is, to state it in the Sanskrita, it is aham, I. This sense of I, not merely I in the nominative sense, not merely I in the grammatical sense, interestingly, not even I in the philosophical sense, but I in the very instinctual sense of me. I juxtaposed to anything not I. The sense that we all have of we ourselves as who we are. Now, that last clause of who we are, that is the crux of the issue when it comes to yoga psychology, and that is this, that while we all have a sense of identity, and indeed this is something that is inherent to the Atman itself, the Atman has a sense of identity. Indeed, I've said and written many times before that in the Sanskrita, the technical term for this is aham pratyaya. Aham pratyaya, that is I cognition, cognizing ourselves as that I, as that subject. So we all have this. Now, the difficulty, of course, is this, that while we indeed have this intrinsic sense of identity of who I am, and it is something that is intrinsic, what happens to many Atmans, and it's not the majority, according to Rig Veda, according to Prabhupada, according to many different sources, it is approximately 1/4 of all Atmans. They misconstrue what is that true I. They make a misidentification. And rather than identifying with themselves as Atman, what of course happens is that they will develop what is called ahamkara. And it's interesting, very few people have pointed this out, even other gurus, etc. You have to know the Sanskrita. And that is that when you hear this term, ahankara, well, we know what that means, those of us who know that term. It means ego, false ego. It's been translated in different ways. But the word itself is fascinating because it's comprised of two words. You hear that aham, that's in there, aham, and then kara from kr, the verb root meaning to do, to perform, to create, to make. So together, ahamkara means the I maker, and that's amazing. So there is the actual I, who I am as spirit soul, as Atman, as true self. But then there is that ahankara, that I creator. In other words, we have the ability within us to create a fake self, a false self, an artificial self that we psychologically are able to identify with so closely to the point where once we do that, we are now in technically what is called maya or illusion. And what a powerful thing is this ahankara. So indeed, now going back to the beginning, so we have a sense of I, we have a sense of self, we have an identity, but we have our true identity on the one hand, but then on the other hand, when we fall into illusion, into egotism, we then create a false sense of identity. We create a self that is disconnected from ourself and not real. And yet we grab onto that as if it is everything. Now, I've given several examples in the past, one of which is a very nice example, actually. I have given this example many times in many talks, but it works perfectly. You can imagine that there is a painting in your home. And imagine it's a painting that looks ever so slightly like you, but it's not. It's a completely different person. Let's say you have brown hair, the person in the painting has brown hair. let's say you're a woman, the person in the painting is a woman, and those are the only two similarities. Otherwise, it's not you. And on top of that, it's a two-dimensional painting. And yet, something happens to you psychologically such that you begin to identify with that painting. As far as you're concerned, you forget completely about the actual you sitting there looking at the painting. But instead, you are convinced that person in the painting is you. And what does that mean? That means that, because you think that's you, you want all good things to go to that painting. You try to feed the painting. You give money to the painting. You just want to make sure that that painting is happy, that it has everything that it needs, all the pleasures of life, etc., etc., etc. In the meantime, the actual you, who's looking upon this painting, of course, is miserable and is not flourishing, is doing the opposite, is just stagnant. Now, this is the question. Is the painting itself even actually flourishing? Of course not. This is the nature of illusion. This is the nature of Maya. That we have convinced ourselves that we are something other than ourselves, so much so that even though no one is benefiting, not the false self, not the Atman, still the totality of our being and our concern is invested in this relationship with that false sense of identity. This is the nature of, indeed, ahankara. Now, this gives a very nice example of what is meant by this term, ahankara. Now, all that being said, we've talked very in depth, including the last time, but of course in so many of my talks, about what is the nature of actual identity, spiritual identity. Again, that aham pratyaya, that I cognition, true self, true I, true identity. Now let's talk just a little bit about what is that fake identity. So again, having initially come to the point of falsely identifying with that which we are not, and thus finding ourselves within the realm of materiality, of samsara, of going through the wheel of birth and death, all fueled by our karma, i.e. our free will decisions, moral decisions, that keep us bound to this wheel of samsara via good decisions, bad decisions, etc. Now finding ourselves in this place. The truth of the matter is that being an illusion, what the singular Atman experiences is nothing less than multiple layers, multiple multiplicities of false identities. So in other words, it's not merely bad enough that the Atman identifies with one thing that it is not, and then it goes through all of its incarnations in that way. But actually it identifies with multiple things. Because, of course, keep in mind, due to samsara, due to the fact that we are reincarnating, we have different bodies, we have different names, we have different species that we are in. We have different ways that we look, we have different concerns, different parents, different cultures, different everything. As a result, even the false identity with which we identify changes again and again and again. So it's an amazing thing to contemplate, that we are existing in a multiplicity of false identities, going from one to another, one to another, one to another. And this indeed is the crux of our problem, to state this in terms of philosophy of religion. This is the problem in accordance with Sanatana Dharma that then needs to be solved via the process of Sanatana Dharma. But now, all this being said, and now tying this in very specifically with yoga psychology, we can understand via yoga psychology that indeed all these multiplicities of misidentifications are something that indeed is a reflection of our being in a way psychologically warped. Because if we are identifying psychologically, and what does that mean? That means on the realm of chitta, that means on the realm of identity, mind, substance, etc. If we are identifying at any moment with that which we are not, then what we are doing is something that is not of the nature of reality. And yet we are doing this continuously during our sojourn within the material world, and jumping from one misidentification to another, to another, to another. And more than this, to the point where some of these misidentifications can be the subtlest of the subtle, to the point where we actually even do think that we know ourselves very well, but we're still actually not quite there, to the point where such misidentification can be exacerbated to the point where we can be considered to be psychologically debilitated. Now we get to the psychology part of this. And what do I mean by this? What I mean by this, of course, are individuals who too closely identify with things that they are not. And of course, sadly, I have to be somewhat careful because we are on Discord, so I have to be a little careful with my wording. But let me just say, we of course, as one of 1,000 examples actually, we now have the transsexual phenomenon that is here, where people are one thing, but due to deep psychological debilitation, they will identify very closely with something else to the point of physically, surgically altering themselves in such a way that is irreversible. So this is how strong artificial identity can be. This is how strong it can be. Now, we've seen the strength of such misidentification in the past, and I've given these examples, where throughout the history of psychology, all psychology, Western, Eastern, wherever you want to look, we've seen that one of the hallmarks of an individual who is psychologically debilitated is the fact that they are identifying themselves as something that they obviously are not to the society around them. So a person will say, oh, I'm Napoleon, and of course they're not. There's some person on a street corner somewhere. I'm Napoleon. I'm George Washington. I'm the President of the United States, ... I am God. I am Jesus. I am the Buddha, etc. So it's a very interesting thing how, of course, we can see socially even the phenomenon of misidentification of self taken to such extremes to the point where even society itself becomes concerned about the well-being of a person. So it's an amazing thing. This is how strong misidentification of self, i.e. ahankara, can be. So indeed, this is the last thing I wanted to speak about when it comes to yoga psychology and how indeed the mind itself, as we're going to see in a moment when we go through these verses, can be our very best friend in that we can use the mind in the way that it is meant to function, i.e. to serve the self, to serve the soul, or the mind itself can be our worst of enemies. When what? When it is no longer under our control. When the mind is not under our control, you can imagine, what analogies can I give? Imagine you're on a massive plane, fully loaded with fuel, and you're 30,000 feet in the sky, and there's no one else on the plane but you. You're the only person on the plane. It's fully fueled. It's at 30,000 feet. It is not an automatic pilot. It is up to you to fly that plane, but you are tied to one of the seats in, let's say, first class. Let's make it comfortable for you. And you cannot escape from being tied up in that seat. And the plane starts to plummet. Well, you can imagine, if you have no control over that plane, it's going to be a disaster. The mind is much more powerful than such a plane. So it's for this reason that indeed, we've been talking about yoga psychology. Yogaschitta vritti nirodhaha. Yogaschitta vritti nirodhaha. This is, according to Patanjali, the very definition of the very purpose of yoga itself. Why does yoga exist? In order to still the modifications of the mind, of mind substance, of chitta. So what does this mean? Well, this is precisely what yoga is there for and how we are to understand the final conclusion of yoga psychology, and that is that using the techniques of yoga. And what does this mean? What do we mean by yoga? We mean the full yoga system, the Ashtanga system. We mean using every aspect of yoga that is there in order to do what? To come to a point of stilling the mind, i.e. controlling the mind in such a way that we can now use this most powerful of human instruments in order to transcend, interestingly, even the mind itself. So this is the goal of yoga psychology. So we've talked about a lot because, again, last week was the introduction to this talk on yoga psychology, and we spoke about this for, 30, 40 minutes, and now we're concluding. This is the entire goal of yoga psychology, is to come to the point of transcending even the psychological, i.e. the psyche itself, which again we spoke about very in depth last time. So with that, I'm going to stop with the introduction. Now we're going to dive into the verses. And we'll try to go through this quickly, which we actually can. So let's first look at the first verse, which is Bhagavad Gita, chapter 6, verse 5. And this verse proceeds in this way. A man must elevate himself by his own mind. not degrade himself. The mind is the friend of the conditioned soul and his enemy as well. So indeed, this is Bhagavan Sri Krishna speaking to Arjuna and saying this where? Bhagavad Gita, what chapter? 6th chapter. What is the 6th chapter? It is the chapter that focuses more so than any of the other chapters, specifically on the yoga system, and specifically on Ashtanga Yoga, Raja Yoga, which is the same thing. So indeed, very significant that Krishna himself is beginning to speak about yoga psychology in the quickest of ways, because truthfully he touches upon this throughout the totality of Bhagavad Gita. So a man must elevate himself by his own mind. So again, the mind is a neutral instrument. It's something that's objective. It's something that, like any instrument, can be used for good, can be used for bad, but it is via this instrument that a person is to elevate himself. What does that mean? Indeed, why does the yoga system, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, even say, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodhaha, stilling of the mind? Well, again, the mind is that bridge between body and Atman itself. The psyche is that bridge between body, between physicality, the external world, and that which is pure transcendence. That being the case, it's via the mind, and that means every aspect of the mind. That means via the intellectual process of philosophical inquiry, etc., and many other things that we've talked about, that the soul has the ability to elevate himself. Now, how does this sentence end? Not degrade himself. Because indeed, using the same mind that could be an instrument of liberation, an individual can choose to instead use it to degrade himself. And how? Oh, you know how, in a million ways. In a million ways. Rather than using the mind to meditate, to ponder, rather than using the memory in a positive sort of way, to have recall of Vedic verses, etc. Rather, we can use our mind to fantasize. We can use our mind conjoined with emotion to just be angry and think about our enemies, think about how there are all those people who we hate, etc., etc. And of course, a million other examples. And in this way, we're just abusing this beautiful, truly beautiful instrument of the mind to instead just do nothing. We can use the mind to degrade ourselves by filling it with worthless fantasy that we find in video games, in pornography, in useless entertainment, etc., etc. So indeed, the mind is a double-edged sword that can be used for good or bad. Now let's go on. The mind is the friend of the conditioned soul, indeed. Just repeating, but going a little deeper, but saying the same thing, that when we have the mind under firm control, i.e. when we are truly a yogi in every sense of that term, our mind is our friend. And what is meant by a friend? For anyone who has had a true friend, a good friend, it's something you can rely on. It's something that you know will always be there. It's something that has your self-interest, that has your interest in mind. It's something in which now, rather than being dependent upon yourself and your abilities alone, now you have an ally who can help you in life. So just like a friend, the mind can be like that also, or it can be his enemy as well. So again, the same thing. What does it mean to have an enemy? So many people in this world, they have enemies. People who, for some reason or another, don't like them. For some reason or another, an enemy sees it as their duty to take you down, etc., etc. And it could be justified, and usually it's not justified. But in any case, so many people have enemies as far as humans in the world who just don't like us. Well, if we have a mind that is uncontrolled, and as I said previously, rather than using it as a sharp instrument, as a sword, in order to discern that which is true from that which is not true, instead we use that mind in a wasteful way to just fantasize. That mind then is our enemy. It's our enemy. It's actually dragging us down. Now let's go on to the next verse, which is chapter 6, verse 6. For him who has conquered the mind is the best of friends, but for one who has failed to do so, his very mind will be the greatest enemy. So indeed, this is reiteration of what was already said. But now, of course, I provided commentary where I already said this, that what is the difference? Oh, it's control over the mind. But now Krishna makes this very, very clear. For him who has conquered the mind. Oh, and this is the word that A.C. Bhaktivedanta Abhaya Charanaravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada decides to use in his translation. Conquer the mind. Not merely control, but conquer. As if the mind is something that is indeed very difficult to control and it must be conquered. Well, that is the case, that the mind is difficult to control. Indeed, at some point in Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna eventually says to Krishna that, oh, Krishna, you've spoken to me about control over the mind, but actually it's easier to control the wind than to control my own mind. It's a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing. So this is why Krishna says here, in accordance with Prabhupada's correct translation, for him who has conquered the mind, if you can come to the point where you have true yogic control over your mind, you have accomplished something wondrous. Let me tell you, to climb Mount Everest would be easier. And to climb Mount Everest, if you know these people who climb Mount Everest, oh, these are people who are disciplined like crazy. These are people who've achieved a lot in their lives. Many of these people actually are millionaires. That's how they can afford to do such a thing and hire people to help them. Climbing Mount Everest is easy. Conquering the mind is more difficult. But if you can do so, what does Krishna say here? The mind is the best of friends. But again, conversely, for one who has failed to conquer the mind, his very mind will be the greatest enemy. So indeed, this is the goal of yoga. This is the goal of yoga. This is why anyone who actually knows the Vedic scriptures, not just on a cursory level, but who has studied it for decades and decades and all of the Vedic literature, they will see similar statements again and again in the Upanishads, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, what to speak of Bhagavad Gita, Yoga Sutras. You will see this interestingly in Mahabharata, that what is the goal of yoga? It is to control the mind. Of course, even that as a means to then what? To do what Krishna now speaks of in the next verse. And that is chapter 6, verse 7, where he says, for one who has conquered the mind, the Paramatman is already reached, for he has attained to tranquility. To such a man, happiness and distress, heat and cold, honor and dishonor are all the same. Now, what is the heart of this verse? You can maybe guess by what I was saying previously. In fact, anyone here, what would you say is the heart of this verse? What is the ultimate goal of yoga?
He has attained tranquility. The Paramatman is reached.
The Paramatman is already reached. That's the ultimate goal. It's sneaky. It's in there. But everything else leads up to that, even though that's right there in the middle. For one who has conquered the mind, so in other words, for one who has attained step A, then the final thing occurs. The Paramatman is reached. That's the goal. That's the goal, that the Paramatman is reached. And what is meant by the Paramatman? Of course, that means the soul of our soul. That means God himself. This is an interesting verse. It starts a step down. For one who has conquered the mind, all right, what then happens? The highest of things, the Paramatman is reached. That's the zenith. Now it takes a step down again for the rest of the verse. And why have you achieved that zenith, that the Paramatman is reached? All right, for he has attained tranquility. Yes. So this goes from conquering of oneself to achieving God. But now it goes back to what are the fruits of having conquered oneself, of having self-realization. For he has attained tranquility. In other words, in order to reach that Paramatman, we have to conquer our mind and we have to have tranquility. What is meant by tranquility? The example that's been given, interestingly, by thousands of gurus since the beginning of time is, of course, a beautiful pond, a beautiful lake, where, maybe you've experienced such a thing, I have, where you see a beautiful lake and, there's almost no wind, and there's nothing disturbing the water, and there are no waves, there's nothing happening on the surface of the water, to the point where you look and you just see tranquility in that lake. That is how our mind is to be. See, when it says, for he has attained tranquility, what Krishna means is, that's the mind. The mind has to have such tranquility, to the point where our very mind is akin to that beautiful pond where nothing is disturbing it, either within or even on the surface. It's simply there in peace. That is how our mind must become. And now let's go on. Now, of course, what do we talk about? One of the central themes of Bhagavad Gita, spoken of in many different ways, again and again and again, and that is detachment. To such a man, and now we have these pairs of opposites, happiness and distress We've all experienced this. Every living entity, indeed, experiences happiness and distress. Think of a species of being, they've experienced happiness and distress. Think of an ant, think of an animal, think of a plant, think of a god, think of an asura, think of a human. We experience happiness and distress. We experience heat and cold. We experience honor and dishonor. For such a man, i.e., one who has conquered his mind and who has attained tranquility, all of these are the same. They're the same. Meaning that he has such a deep level of detachment that, now, let me play, of course, Asura's advocate. Does it mean, is Krishna saying here, that he has now lost the ability to see the distinction between these opposites? Of course not. He understands, oh, this produces happiness, this produces distress. Oh, it's kind of a cold day today. Oh, it's a hot day. He can still distinguish. He doesn't become a rock. Does he veer naturally, like all beings, toward that which is happiness? Does he seek distress? No. No. Does he seek dishonor? No. But what is detachment? Whichever of these pairs of opposites come to him, he is tranquil. He is tranquil. Now, all that being said, when a person has conquered his mind, when he has tranquility, when he has this type of detachment, this detachment from all things that occur to him, what is the result? Paramatman is reached. In other words, now he has the ability truly to know God. And that is the ultimate goal. That is the ultimate goal, is to know God. First, we conquer really ourselves. First, we know ourselves such that then, looking within, understanding our own Atman, our own self, our own identity of true I, spiritual I, we now have the ability to take that I and looking even deeper within the very heart of our Atman itself and seeing Paramatman, that supreme self, that supreme I, in other words, God, who is there lying within even our very own soul. What then happens to that Atman via devotion? That I awareness is still there, but now there is a you awareness as well, and that you being God, to the point where that I is always there, but that you takes precedence. That is surrender. That is prapatti, where there's always I, but I am I because of you. And such is surrender. Such is the goal. And in such a manner is the goal achieved. Very good. Well, with that, everyone, thank you very much for listening to my discourse on these verses from Bhagavad Gita, as well as now this was chapter 2 of my introduction to yoga psychology. Jaya Shriman Narayana.
Jaya Shriman Narayana.
Take care. Namaste.